So a migration policy between Britain and Rwanda has sparked global outrage. The deal, which was announced last week, will see some of those illegally crossing into the UK being sent to Rwanda for resettlement. For more on this now, let's bring in Human Rights Watch's UK Advocacy and Communications Coordinator, Dr. Emilie McDonnell, who's live to us from London. Great to see you, Doc. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Perhaps let's begin by those who are not necessarily following the story quite closely by unpacking what this asylum partnership agreement entails, because for one, the UK said that they're putting this in place in order to try break smuggling networks, but obviously a lot of people see things differently.
Thanks so much for having me. Yes, this agreement is essentially one to expel asylum seekers that arrive irregularly to the UK, to Rwanda. So what this represents is the UK entirely shirking its responsibilities to people seeking asylum. And it's important to note that they'll be processed then under Rwanda's asylum system, and if found to be a refugee, to actually stay there in Rwanda. Or Rwanda will deport them or otherwise handle their rejected case. But it's really a one-way ticket. So they'll not be provided asylum at all in the UK under this.
Why would Rwanda agree to this?
Well, that's a very good question. But it's part of a broader trend that we've seen where countries such as the UK, such as Australia, such as the US, find a country such as Rwanda who they can offer financial incentives to resettle their refugees effectively and shift the burden onto them.
Ah, right. Okay, and we've seen countries like Australia, for instance, take on this kind of model, and sadly, things didn't necessarily work out well, at least insofar as the human rights record is concerned. And I guess this is what underpins a lot of the pushback from this new agreement between the UK and Rwanda.
Yes, so the UK's arrangement with Rwanda is definitely modelled off the Australian model. And what we know from Australia's offshore regime on Nauru and Papua New Guinea is that it caused more than 8 years of immense suffering, which is why there has been such backlash, because this was a failed policy. 12 people died since the policy began in 2013. Men, women and children suffered inhumane treatment, medical neglect. There was also widespread violations against women in terms of sexual assault, harassment, and in terms of the effectiveness that you mentioned as well. Boat crossings actually peaked when offshore processing was implemented. So it is very disastrous that the UK is choosing to go down this path.
Yeah. I mean, is there any kind of distinguishing where the asylum seekers come from? I mean, is this like a blanket agreement, for lack of a better term, that will see all asylum seekers arriving in the UK being sent on this one-way ticket, as you put it, to Rwanda?
So what we do know is that any asylum seeker can be expelled who arrives irregularly to the UK, so whether by boat or by lorry. However, under the UK's own laws that actually are empowering this agreement, the only group that we can see that are currently excluded are unaccompanied minor children. So yes, as you say, anyone other than unaccompanied minor children could face being expelled to Rwanda on that one-way ticket, which is incredibly inhumane and incredibly cruel.
What is interesting is the UK saying nothing around what they're doing is in breach of any international law. In fact, they're saying that this is meeting all their international legal obligations, but nothing being said about Rwanda's questionable human rights record, especially given what's happened in the past with asylum seekers there.
So first of all, it's just not true that this arrangement complies with the UK's international obligations. It is very likely to breach them. The UK has an obligation to ensure access to its territory for people seeking asylum, to provide them access to an asylum procedure, to due process. Simply expelling them and expelling those who've already undergone a very dangerous journey and abdicating their responsibilities onto another country is starkly against the spirit and the letter of the whole international refugee protection regime. And coming to Rwanda, Rwanda is not a safe country to send asylum seekers to. Just last year, the UK government itself denounced Rwanda's human rights record before the UN, despite now calling it one of the safest countries in the world. Rwanda has a known track record of extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention, ill treatment and torture in detention facilities. And we also know, and Human Rights Watch has documented, that refugees have faced abuse in Rwanda. So just to name one case is that 12 refugees were shot dead by government forces in 2018 when they protested cuts to their food rations and their conditions. So there are grave concerns that asylum seekers who were sent there would be at risk of abuse were they to speak up about their conditions or their treatment.
Yeah. So this plan, by the sounds of it, may be legally questionable, morally reprehensible, but is it actually practical in a context where tens of thousands of asylum seekers would essentially be needed to be sent on this route?
It is very likely to be ineffective, and as I mentioned, under Australia's regime, it wasn't effective. The only way to actually reduce deaths at sea, to stop people crossing the English Channel by boat or by lorry, to minimise and reduce people smuggling, people trafficking, is to provide safe routes for people to come to the UK, to seek asylum, to reunify with their family. And so this deal does nothing to actually address the reasons that people are travelling irregularly and through these very dangerous, harrowing means to get to the UK.
Yeah, we've lost count how many times we've heard of boats capsizing on the English Channel as people try to get to the UK. But what is also perplexing, Doc, is the UK is currently being very generous to people needing asylum from places like Ukraine, for instance. I mean, of course, we can do both, but it doesn't really make sense to, on the one hand, open up, your doors and your hearts, essentially, from those seeking asylum because of what's taking place in Ukraine, and not extend that charitability to those who arrive through the English Channel.
Exactly. So the people of Britain have really, as you say, they've opened their hearts, they've opened their homes to Ukrainians, but the government on the other side is choosing to act with cruelty. And indeed, in terms of Ukraine, the UK is still the only government in Europe who is choosing to impose and to keep in place bureaucratic barriers for people to flee. So it's still imposing visa requirements on Ukrainians to come to the UK, which is making it very difficult for people to get here. There are thousands of Ukrainians who are still stuck, unable to reunify with their family because they're waiting for their visas to be processed.
How much of this agreement do you think would resonate with people in the UK on the back of the sentiment of those who are asking for the country to leave the EU, essentially? A lot of that rhetoric was around the closing of borders, prioritizing people from the UK. Sentiments, dare I say, that aren't necessarily unique to Britain.
Perhaps, when we're thinking about, why the UK is doing this, it is choosing to close its borders. It is choosing to act with inhumanity and cruelty instead of providing these safe routes. And at the end of the day, everyone has the right to seek asylum, and it is the UK who has obligations under international law to ensure that it is providing protection to individuals that come to its shores.
Yeah. Very quickly, Doc, is this a done deal? Is this the end of it? Of course, there's backlash, activists like yourself trying to raise awareness around why this is not something to be supported. But, I mean, legally speaking, what kind of instruments are there to at least challenge this agreement and perhaps repel it?
So the agreement has been signed, as you mentioned earlier. However, we do envision that there will be a number of legal challenges, whether that is to the agreement itself, questioning whether Rwanda is a safe country, as well as to, when it gets to this stage, to individuals who will be expelled there, challenging their individual removal to Rwanda.
Dr. Emilie McDonnell, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate your breaking down what really is a troubling story. Dr. McDonnell is the Human Rights Watch's UK Advocacy and Communications Coordinator. Thanks very much indeed once again.